Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into the high desert of the American Southwest, where the red rock country runs wide and ancient, and some things that move through the dark out there don't have a name you're supposed to say out loud. This is the story of the Skinwalker. Before we get settled, if you enjoy this kind of content, go ahead and like the video and hit subscribe. It genuinely helps. And drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from tonight? And what time is it where you are? And if you're from the Southwest, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, I want to hear from you especially. Did someone in your family ever refuse to talk about certain things at night? Did a grandparent ever change the subject the moment a particular word came up? You don't have to say what it was, but if you know, you know. Now dim the lights. Maybe pull a blanket up. Let's ease into this one slowly, because this story deserves that. You think you know what a skinwalker is, and that's exactly the problem. You've seen the word everywhere, threaded through Reddit comment sections, stitched into TikTok videos, dropped casually into conversations about things people spotted on night drives through the desert. You have a shape for it in your head. Something fast, something wrong. Human-shaped but not quite, running on all fours at speeds that shouldn't be possible, glowing eyes in the headlights, gone before you can be sure of what you saw. That version is real, in the sense that it exists and people have described it, but the shape you have in your head is a surface, a sketch. The version the internet handed you is missing about 9 layers underneath, and those layers are the part that actually matters. Because here's what you didn't get from the TikTok. The Navajo people, the people this legend belongs to, do not talk about this casually. They do not say the name at night. They do not tell outsiders the full story. And that reluctance isn't folklore flavour. It isn't superstition for atmosphere. It isn't something they do to make the legend feel scarier. It comes from a specific understanding of how this thing works, what it responds to, and what saying its name out loud actually invites. We will get to that. But first, you need to take apart what you think you know and start over, because the real story is older and stranger and considerably more unsettling than anything an algorithm handed you. Here is a useful reference point. The academic who produced the most comprehensive documented study of Navajo witchcraft, anthropologist Clyde Kluckhohn, published his work in 1944 after years of fieldwork. He was working with the cooperation of Navajo people who were willing to speak with him, which was already a small and selective group. Even so, the book he produced, Navajo Witchcraft, is full of gaps. Accounts that stop before the part the speaker didn't want to say. Descriptions that circle around details without landing on them. Kluckhohn himself acknowledged that he was working with partial information, that the complete picture was held by people who had no intention of giving it to him, and that the guardedness was not accidental. That was 1944. 80 years later, the guardedness has not decreased. It has, if anything, become more specific about what it's protecting against. Kluckhohn spent years earning the trust of a community specifically known for not trusting outsiders, produced a landmark academic text, and still came back with a book full of sections that essentially say, and then they stop talking. As research careers go, it's a very honest one. Let's start with who the Navajo actually are, not background information, foundation, because you cannot understand the Skinwalker without understanding what it stands against. The Navajo call themselves Diné, the people. Their homeland spans parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. High desert country, red rock country, the kind of landscape that makes you feel small in a way that isn't unpleasant, just honest. They are one of the largest indigenous nations in the United States, with a spiritual tradition built over thousands of years that is layered and complex and still living. Not museum piece mythology, but an active, functioning way of understanding the world. At the centre of that tradition is a concept called hozu. It translates roughly as harmony, or balance, or walking in beauty, but none of those English words quite capture it. Hozu is the state in which all things exist in right relationship with each other. People, animals, land, sky, the living and the dead, the physical and the spiritual. Everything connected, everything in its proper place and proportion. Maintaining Hozo is not a passive thing. It is active, daily, ceremonial. It requires attention and effort and the right knowledge applied at the right time. Illness is understood in this framework not purely as a biological event but as a disruption of balance. Something in the relationship between a person and their world has gone out of alignment. The treatment is therefore not only physical, it is restoration of the person, of the relationships around them, of the harmony that was broken by whatever caused the disruption. A Navajo healing ceremony does not just address symptoms. It addresses the conditions that allowed those symptoms to exist. This matters for understanding the Skinwalker, because the Skinwalker is the deliberate inverse of this system. Where the medicine person's purpose is restoration, the Skinwalker's purpose is disruption. Where Hozu requires that everything be in right relationship, the Skinwalker exists specifically to break those relationships between a person and their health, between a community and its trust in its members, between the living and the dead. The Skinwalker is not just evil in the general sense. It is the structural opposite of everything Navajo spiritual life is organized around, which is why encountering one is not just frightening. It is, in the Navajo framework, a kind of cosmological offense. The wrong thing in the wrong place, doing the wrong work with the right tools. The people responsible for that maintenance are the medicine men and women, and this is where the story starts to get complicated. To become a medicine person among the Navajo, you spend years, sometimes decades, learning. Ceremonies that take days to perform, sand paintings of extraordinary complexity and precision, chants and songs specific to conditions and situations, each one memorized in full because writing them down isn't how this knowledge lives. The healing traditions are vast. The responsibility is enormous, and the knowledge required to heal people is, by its nature, also knowledge of what causes harm. There is no written exam at the end of this, no certification board, no laminated card that says you can now perform a multi-day healing ceremony. You either know it or you don't, and the only way to know it is to have spent years with someone who already does, memorizing things that cannot be written down in a language that was not designed to be written. The Navajo medical licensing process makes a standard residency look like a long weekend. You cannot protect against darkness without understanding darkness. You cannot treat a curse without knowing how a curse is constructed. The medicine person walks close to both sides of that line, because that is what the work requires. Most of them spend their whole lives serving their community and never cross it. But the knowledge is the same. The choice is what differs. And somewhere back in the origin of the Navajo creation story, in the account first recorded by ethnographer Washington Matthews in 1894, drawn from the emergence myth of first man and first woman, witchcraft enters the world, not from outside, not from some invading force, from within, from the misuse of sacred knowledge, from a choice. That is the first thing you need to understand about the Skinwalker. It is not a creature that was made by accident or created by some outside evil, or conjured from a dark place without a name. It was a person who knew things, a person who chose to use those things in a specific direction, for a specific purpose, at a specific and irreversible cost. The Navajo call this path the Witchery Way. It is one of several categories of witchcraft recognized within Navajo tradition. There are practitioners of sorcery, practitioners who use curse objects, practitioners of something called the Frenzy Way, but the Witchery Way is considered the highest level and the most dangerous. The naaldlooshii, the Skinwalker specifically, is a practitioner of the Witchery Way who has reached the point of full animal transformation. Not all Witchery Way practitioners can do this. The shape-shifting is the advanced credential. It means you have gone far enough down that road that the boundary between human and animal no longer holds the way it does for everyone else. And what it requires to enter it is not a ritual you'd find dramatic. It is not an elaborate ceremony with fire and incantation in some hidden cave, though those elements exist further down the path. The entry point is simpler and worse. To gain access to the powers of the Witchery Way, to take the first step onto that road and have it actually work, you must kill a close family member, usually a sibling, not a stranger, not an enemy, someone you share blood with, someone whose absence will follow you the rest of your life. Most dark traditions have a price of entry that is at least abstractly dramatic. This one went in a different direction. The application process for the Witchery Way is essentially destroy the most irreplaceable relationship you have. The supernatural powers come later. First, prove you mean it. That act is the price of admission, and the reason for it is not arbitrary cruelty. The killing of a family member is the deliberate severing of the thing that makes you part of a community. It is the destruction of your most fundamental human bond. What the Witchery Way is purchasing with that act is the removal of the part of you that belongs to other people, the part that hesitates, the part that protects instead of harms. Think about the architecture of that for a moment. Other dark traditions in other cultures require sacrifice of the self, pain, deprivation, isolation. This one requires something different. It requires that you destroy someone else's life in order to hollow out a specific thing in yours. The targeted removal of conscience, dressed up as initiation. Whatever professional credential the Witchery Way is handing out, the application process is thorough. After the initiation, new members are welcomed into the Society of Witches. They gather in hidden places, dark caves and remote locations where no one comes. They perform ceremonies that are deliberate inversions of the healing rituals, the same structure, the same movements, the same songs, but corrupted. Sand paintings made not to restore balance but to direct harm toward a specific person. Chants sung backwards, or altered in ways that flip the intention from protection to destruction. They feast. They initiate further. They plan. The initiate learns to access and wear animal forms. They learn the corpse powder, how to make it, how to deploy it. They learn the mind techniques, reading, controlling, projecting fear. Each new ability earned through continued practice of the Witchery Way, through continued harm. The power is not a gift, it is a transaction, and the currency never stops being owed. Once that part is gone, the rest becomes possible. Now let's talk about what the rest actually is, because the Skinwalker's abilities are not the shape-shifting special effects the internet tends to focus on. The transformation is real, but it is one tool among several, and some of the others are considerably more disturbing. The shape-shifting works like this. The person who has entered the Witchery Way can take the form of an animal by wearing its pelt. This is where the name comes from. They walk in the skin of another creature. Because of this, the pelt of any predatory animal is considered taboo among the Navajo. You do not wear wolf skin. You do not wear coyote skin. You do not wear bear hide. The only skins traditionally permitted for use are sheepskin and buckskin, and only for specific ceremonial purposes. Every other pelt carries risk, because every other pelt is what they use. The process, based on accounts gathered from Navajo sources over the past century, involves more than just putting on the skin. There is a mental component sometimes called imprinting, in which the practitioner fixes the animal's form in their mind in specific detail before attempting the transformation. The imprinting only needs to happen once per animal. After that, the form is accessible on demand. A skinwalker who has spent years in the Witchery Way may have several animal forms available, each one locked in and ready without the original work needing to be repeated. They choose based on what the situation requires. bear for strength, wolf for distance, coyote for deception, crow for surveillance, owl for silence and patience. The body becomes a wardrobe. What they're selecting each night is a tool, and the selection is deliberate. The animals most commonly associated with the transformation are coyote, wolf, fox, owl, and crow. Not coincidentally, these are animals already associated in Navajo culture with trickery, darkness, or death. The coyote is the trickster. The owl is the carrier of death omens. The crow circles above the dying. The skinwalker doesn't choose these forms randomly. They choose based on what they need. The wolf's speed for travelling distances quickly, the coyote's cunning for deception, the owl's silence for moving through the dark without being heard. In their chosen animal form they are fast, faster than should be possible. Accounts describe animals running alongside moving vehicles and keeping pace without effort. Tracks in the desert that start as animal prints and shift mid-stride into something else. A deer spotted on the roadside that, as your headlights hit it, rises onto its hind legs and walks away like a person. The tell, if you're looking for one, is the eyes. In human form, the skinwalker's eyes look like animal eyes, reflective, wrong in the face, not quite tracking the way human eyes do. In animal form, the reverse. The eyes look human. That is the crack in the disguise, and it is the only one. There is a particular kind of account that surfaces repeatedly across Navajo communities, and the consistency of it is one of the things that makes it hard to dismiss. Someone driving alone at night on a reservation road, no streetlights, no shoulders, just 2 lanes of asphalt cut through open desert with nothing on either side. They notice something running in the ditch alongside the car. It keeps pace easily at 60 miles per hour. When they speed up, it speeds up. When they slow to look, it slows too and turns its head toward the window, and the eyes catch the interior light for a moment. Wrong eyes. The kind that do not belong in that face. The driver speeds up again, which seems like the correct decision, and the thing eventually disappears into the dark. Most of these accounts end there. The person gets home. They don't speak about it for a while, sometimes ever. The reason this type of encounter is so consistent across people who have never met each other, and in some cases have never left their communities, is worth sitting with. There is also the question of what the skinwalker looks like between forms. Not finished as an animal, not fully human anymore, taller than it should be, moving wrong, bent at joints that don't bend that way, fur or skin not sitting flush against what's underneath, something that borrowed a shape and hasn't finished putting it on. Not all encounters involve the completed transformation. Some people see the in-between, and those accounts tend to go quiet quickly, because at a certain point words stop doing the work. During the day they look like everyone else. That detail is not incidental. It's the architecture of the fear. Because the skinwalker is not a monster that lives out in the wild somewhere, separate from human life. It lives in the community. It attends the same gatherings. It eats at the same fires. It knows who is sick and who is vulnerable and who has made enemies recently and who lives alone. It chooses its victims, its timing, its approach, with the advantage of familiarity. The information it uses to harm people is information it gathered while being trusted. This is the element that the TikTok version consistently drops, because it is harder to render in 30 seconds than glowing eyes and highway footage. The skinwalker is frightening not because it comes from outside the world, you know. It is frightening because it comes from inside it. You're not afraid of the dark thing out in the desert that has nothing to do with you. You're afraid of the person sitting across the fire from you who knows your name and your family and your home and the specific sound of your child's voice, and who is also that thing. There is a Navajo account, passed down in various forms across communities, of a grandfather who refused to let the family speak certain words at night. Not as a rule imposed by authority, but as something he enforced quietly, consistently, without drama. If someone brought up a particular subject after dark, he would redirect the conversation. He would not explain why in the moment. He waited until children were older to explain what he understood about who in the community was not entirely what they appeared to be, and why naming certain things at night was an invitation rather than a description. He died knowing things he did not pass on because the transmission itself carried risk. That category of knowledge, things you carry alone because sharing them costs too much, is a weight the Skinwalker creates in communities it moves through. The silence around it is not absence, it is protective structure. Now let's talk about what they actually do. The Skinwalker operates on fear and harm. They are not predators hunting at random. They work with intention, motivated by revenge, jealousy, greed, or spite. They target specific people. They use specific methods, and the methods go well beyond the physical. The corpse powder, called anti in Navajo, is the weapon that most people have never heard of, and it is worse than the shape-shifting. It is made from the ground bones of the dead, specifically the bones of infants, and it is used as a curse delivery system. Blown into someone's face, poured down the smoke hole of a home while the family sleeps inside, scattered across a threshold. The symptoms start with the tongue turning black. Then come convulsions, then paralysis, then death, sometimes slow. The powder causes a wasting illness that can look, from the outside, like any number of ordinary diseases, which is part of why it has always been so difficult to identify and counter. A person who dies from it looks, to anyone not familiar with what to look for, like someone who simply got sick and did not recover. No wound, no obvious cause, just a gradual deterioration that the community may not connect to anything external until well after the damage is done. The delivery methods are worth understanding because they are methodical. Blown directly into a face requires proximity, which means the Skinwalker was close enough to be recognised if seen. But poured down the smoke hole of a home at night requires only access to the outside of the building, and the sleeping family inside receives the exposure without ever knowing someone was there. Scattered across a threshold means that anyone entering or leaving the home over the following days makes contact with it. The corpse powder is patient in a way that the person deploying it does not need to be. It does not expire, it waits. Congratulations. Your home security system was apparently not rated for airborne bone powder delivered through the ventilation. Nobody covered that one in the instructions. There is also the eye contact. If a Skinwalker locks eyes with you, in some accounts, this allows them to absorb themselves into your body. A possession that comes not through invitation, but through a single unguarded moment of looking directly at something you should have looked away from. In other accounts, the eye contact simply freezes you. Plants fear directly into your nervous system in a way that bypasses thought entirely, leaving you standing in the road while it takes stock of you and decides what comes next. They can read minds, they can mimic voices, not approximately but exactly, down to the specific emotional quality of someone you love in distress. Your child crying in the dark, your mother calling your name from just outside the door. The voice is perfect. The source is wrong. This is one of the most consistent details across accounts, and one of the most effective tools for getting someone to open a door or leave a lit space and step outside into the dark. They can also control other animals. Set a wolf to follow someone. Direct an owl to perch outside a window night after night as an omen or a message. The natural world becomes part of the toolkit, and if the situation requires it, they can call up the dead, reanimate corpses and direct them against living targets, which means that the Skinwalker's reach extends not just across the living community, but into whatever lies on the other side of it. All of this from a person who once knew the healing songs. The Navajo word for wolf is maiko. It also means witch. That overlap is not accidental. The wolf in Navajo tradition is not feared because of what a wolf is. It is feared because of what a human becomes when they put on its skin. This is the thing the internet version keeps getting backwards. The Skinwalker is not a supernatural creature that people discovered and named. It is a category of human being, a specific kind of corruption, with a specific origin, specific capabilities, and specific vulnerabilities. It walks among the Navajo because it came from the Navajo. It knows the songs because it learned them. It knows the ceremonies because it was trained in them. And it turned all of that knowledge, all of that trust, all of that sacred education around and aimed it at the community that gave it to them. That is why the fear is different from what you felt reading a Reddit thread. The Reddit thread is about a creature. What the Navajo live with is the knowledge that the most dangerous thing is not out in the dark waiting for you. It is someone who learned everything good about your world and then chose differently. By now you have the shape of it, the origin, the initiation, the powers, the presence it maintains in daily life. But knowing what a skinwalker is only gets you so far. The more important question, the one that ties directly to why the Navajo guard this knowledge the way they do, is what the skinwalker is actually for. Not for the skinwalker, for the legend. Every culture that has endured for thousands of years has developed stories that serve as warnings, boundary markers, explanations for suffering that appears from nowhere, frameworks for the kind of harm that comes from within a community rather than from outside it. The Skinwalker story does all of those things simultaneously. It explains illness when medicine has no answer. It explains the sudden reversal of fortune. It explains the crop that fails, and the livestock that dies, and the child who wastes away despite everything done to help. These things need a cause, because human beings are not equipped to sit comfortably with the idea that suffering is purely random. But the Skinwalker story does something more specific than that. It is a story about the misuse of power, about what happens to someone who takes sacred knowledge and turns it inward, toward personal gain, away from the community that trusted them with it, about what the community loses when one of its healers becomes its predator. That is not a small lesson. That is a lesson about the structure of trust and what its collapse costs everyone. The Navajo do not discuss the Skinwalker casually, because this is not casual information. It is not a legend in the way the word legend tends to get used. Something historical, something from long ago, something safely contained in the past. For many Navajo people, this is a present reality, a lived concern, something that requires active management and awareness, not academic discussion with outsiders who are going to post about it online afterward. Which brings us to where things stand today, because the internet found the Skinwalker, and the internet, which has never once in its existence encountered something sacred and decided to leave it alone, did what the internet does. And that is where things get complicated in a different way. So the internet found the Skinwalker. And the thing about the internet finding a piece of indigenous sacred knowledge is that it doesn't find it the way a researcher finds it, cautiously, with context, with awareness of what the information costs the people it belongs to. It finds it the way a golden retriever finds an unattended sandwich, enthusiastically, without any concept of why the sandwich was left there unattended in the first place. By the early 2000s, Skinwalker had become a fixture of online paranormal communities. By 2010, it was a reliable presence in horror fiction forums. By the mid-2000s, TikTok and Reddit had turned it into something you encountered casually, the way you encounter weather. Someone posts a blurry video of a coyote moving oddly at the edge of a highway. Within 6 hours, 1,000 people have diagnosed it as a skinwalker. Someone shares a story about feeling watched on a desert road at night. The comments are immediate and unanimous. Someone makes a joke about skinwalkers at 3 a.m. and gets 50,000 likes. The Navajo watched this happen from inside their communities, where the same information was something entirely different. where it wasn't content, where it carried weight that doesn't compress into a video format. There is a particular kind of dissonance in watching something sacred to you become a meme. Not just uncomfortable, specifically dissonant. Because the meme version and the real version share a name and a basic shape, and from the outside they look like the same thing. From the inside they are not even in the same category. One is a piece of entertainment that people engage with and forget by lunchtime. The other is a reason why your grandfather wouldn't let certain words be said after dark. A reason that he took seriously enough to enforce consistently for the rest of his life without ever fully explaining it to people he didn't trust to handle it. The internet took the first one and assumed it had found the second. It had not. It had found the shadow of it, flat on the ground, and concluded it understood the thing that was casting it. Cherokee Nation scholar Adrienne Keene, who founded the website Native Appropriations, has written about what this kind of cultural extraction costs. Her point is not that outsiders are malicious. Most of them are not. Her point is that when a piece of living sacred knowledge gets stripped of its context and turned into entertainment, the people it belongs to absorb the consequences. They get questions they are not supposed to answer. They get misrepresentations they are expected to correct. They get a version of their own belief system handed back to them, reshaped by people who encountered it for 30 seconds and felt confident about what they found. The Navajo did not ask for any of this. They also did not get to opt out of it. There is also the specific problem of what happens when outsiders come looking. Skinwalker Ranch is located in the Winter Basin of northeastern Utah, about 400 miles north of Navajo Nation. It sits on land traditionally associated with the Ute people, not the Navajo, which is its own layer of complexity that the TV show about it tends to skip past quickly. The ranch spans roughly 512 acres and has, since the 1990s, accumulated a reputation as a hotspot for unexplained phenomena. Cattle mutilations, lights in the sky, equipment failure, animals appearing and disappearing in ways that leave no physical explanation. The Sherman family, who purchased the property in 1994, lasted 18 months before selling. 18 months is approximately the amount of time it takes for maybe it's just the area settling to become, we need to leave immediately and never come back. They sold to a Las Vegas real estate developer named Robert Bigelow, who was not purchasing it as a farming investment. Bigelow was interested in the paranormal, funded research into it, and turned the ranch into a surveillance operation almost immediately. The name Skinwalker Ranch did not come from the Navajo. It came from local Ute oral tradition, which holds that the land sits on what they call the path of the Skinwalker. The Ute and Navajo share a long and complicated history of conflict, and one layer of that history involves the belief that the Navajo, during a period of intense territorial conflict, directed skinwalkers onto Ute land as a form of warfare. The Ute Cultural Rights and Protection Director, when asked about this by a reporter in 2020, acknowledged that oral traditions around the area exist, but noted that she personally had never heard confirmation of a specific Navajo curse being placed there, which is not a denial. It is a careful statement from someone who understands exactly what kind of information she's being asked to put on record. The Ute people have lived adjacent to the land that is now Skinwalker Ranch for at least 15 generations by their own reckoning. 15 generations of keeping a specific distance from a specific stretch of ground. Not out of superstition, out of accumulated experience with what happens to people who don't. The Myers family, who owned the property before the Shermans and lived on it for over 60 years, reportedly experienced nothing unusual. They left in 1987. The land sat empty for 7 years. The Shermans arrived in 1994, started experiencing things they couldn't explain within weeks, and were gone by 1996. The pattern of who has trouble there and who doesn't has not produced any clean explanations. The Ute, who have the longest institutional memory of the area, continue to regard it as land you approach with caution, if you approach it at all. The ranch changed hands again in 2016, sold to an anonymous buyer who turned out to be Brandon Fugel, a Utah real estate developer who announced ownership in 2020 alongside a History Channel deal. The show is called The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch. It has been running for multiple seasons. Researchers with expensive equipment investigate anomalies on the property, while cameras document the process. Findings are suggestive and never conclusive. Equipment fails at inconvenient moments. Something always seems to be happening just outside the frame. The US government was briefly, officially interested in the ranch. A program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program received $22 million in funding, pushed through by Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid to study unexplained aerial phenomena. Skinwalker Ranch was one of the focal points. The program ran from 2007 to 2012. After 5 years and $22 million, the conclusion was approximately, something unusual appears to be occurring here, and we're not sure what it is. As government research outcomes go, that one took a while to arrive at something most visitors figured out in an afternoon. None of this, it should be noted, has much to do with what the Navajo actually mean when they speak of the naaldlooshii. The ranch absorbed the name and the atmosphere of the legend and built a media property around it. The living tradition it borrowed from continued existing in the communities where it has always existed, largely uninterested in whether the History Channel found anything interesting in Utah. The ranch is now a branded experience. There is merchandise. There are guided experiences available for purchase. If you want to stand on the land where a family fled in terror after 18 months, and the government spent $22 million arriving at we don't know, that opportunity is available to you at a reasonable price point. Capitalism took a look at 8,000 years of sacred fear and saw a licensing opportunity, which is either impressive or deeply predictable, and the answer is probably both. Now, let's talk about what the Skinwalker actually does to a community it moves through. Not the dramatic events, the slow ones, the ones that don't make it into TikTok videos because there's nothing to film. When a Skinwalker is known or suspected to be operating within a community, the effect on daily life is specific and cumulative. People stop doing things they would otherwise do without thinking. They stop saying certain things after dark. They stop walking alone at night on familiar routes that suddenly feel different. They start paying attention to whose livestock is healthy and whose is not, whose family has had recent misfortune, who has been behaving strangely, who has accumulated unexplained wealth. These observations happen quietly, shared in small trusted groups rather than broadly, because the wrong accusation is its own kind of damage. A person falsely accused of being a skinwalker carries that accusation in a community with a long memory. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from sustained low-level vigilance. Not the sharp alertness of an immediate threat, but the slow, grinding awareness of something that may or may not be there, that you cannot confirm but cannot dismiss, that requires you to move through familiar spaces with slightly more care than they used to require. The Skinwalker's most effective weapon may not be the corpse powder or the shape-shifting. It may simply be the effect its presence has on the people around it. A community that is watching itself, questioning its own members, measuring its words and its movements, is a community spending resources on defense that would otherwise go toward living. The Skinwalker doesn't need to harm everyone directly. It needs to be known to exist, and the rest follows. The social texture of suspicion is one of the less discussed effects of a living Skinwalker belief system. It functions partly as social vigilance, a community actively monitoring itself for the specific kind of corruption the Skinwalker represents. But it also creates vulnerability. Accusations have historically been levelled at people who are unusual, people who didn't share resources the way custom required, people who recovered from illness when others died, people whose success seemed disproportionate. The Navajo Witch Purge of 1878 happened in part because a community under extreme pressure needed somewhere to direct it, and the framework of Skinwalker belief provided both the target category and the justification for action. The Long Walk of 1864 is essential context here. The US Army, led by Kit Carson, forced approximately 8,000 Navajo men, women and children to march more than 300 miles to Fort Sumner in New Mexico, a place called Bosque Redondo. The march took months. Roughly 200 people died during the journey itself. At Bosque Redondo, conditions were consistently brutal. Water was bad, crops failed, disease moved through the population in waves. People watched their children die in a place they had been taken to against their will, on land that was not theirs, under conditions the government had not prepared for and did not fix quickly. They were there for 4 years. When the Navajo were finally permitted to return to their homeland in 1868, they came back changed in ways that took a long time to fully surface. The US government's official position on the Long Walk, once it became clear the Bosque Redondo plan was not working, was that a mistake had been made. 4 years, 200 deaths on the march alone, an unknown number of additional deaths from disease and starvation at the reservation, and the official summary was mistake. The Navajo, who had a more detailed understanding of what had happened, were allowed to go home. The trauma went home with them. The spiritual upheaval of those 4 years had been profound. Some accounts suggest that during the worst of the Bosque Redondo period, some Navajo turned to shape-shifting as a form of escape or survival. The desperation of a people whose gods felt absent, pushing some of them toward paths they would not otherwise have taken. Whether that is literal or metaphorical is a question that belongs to the Navajo tradition to answer. What is not in question is the aftermath. By 1878, tensions in the community had been building for a decade. When a collection of witch artifacts was found wrapped in a copy of the Treaty of 1868, the document that had supposedly guaranteed the Navajos' return to their homeland, the combination of spiritual violation and political betrayal produced something volatile. 40 people were killed in what became known as the Navajo Witch Purge. They were accused skinwalkers, people whom the community had identified as the source of the accumulated suffering of the previous decade. The purge was not a moment of panic. It was a deliberate, organised response carried out according to the community's own framework for dealing with this specific kind of threat. It worked, in the sense that it restored a degree of balance to the community's sense of itself. It cost 40 lives to get there. Anthropologist Aileen Allison, writing about the purge in an Arizona State University literary magazine, made the point that the Navajo approach to witchcraft accusations had always been fundamentally different from the Salem trials that most outsiders instinctively reach for as a comparison. Salem was driven by external religious panic, young women's testimony, and a legal apparatus that had no framework for distinguishing credible accusations from fear-driven ones. The Navajo framework was internal, community-based, and tied to observable social behaviours rather than spectral evidence. The accusation that stuck was the one that explained a pattern, not the one that came from a dream. That distinction doesn't make the 1878 deaths less real. It makes the context around them more complicated than a simple parallel allows. Allison also noted that within the Navajo tradition, the killing of a confirmed witch had never been considered murder. A person who became a skinwalker had, by that act, forfeited their standing as a person in the community's moral framework. The law that applied to killing people did not apply to killing something that had willingly stopped being one. This was not a loophole. It was a coherent position within a system that took the skinwalker's existence seriously as a category. The question the Navajo were asking in 1878 was not whether witches deserved to die. The question was whether the 40 people identified were actually witches. That is a different question, and it is the one that historians continue to find difficult to resolve at a distance of 150 years. Now let's talk about how you actually identify one. Because the Skinwalker lives in the community, the identification problem is not a simple one. You're not looking for a monster, you're looking for a person who has learned to appear completely normal during the day and uses that appearance as cover. The tells, such as they are, accumulate over time and require someone paying sustained attention. The first category of tell is behavioural. A Skinwalker is motivated by personal gain, revenge, or the consolidation of power. They tend to accumulate more than community norms would explain. They tend to recover from things they should not recover from. They tend to be present, in a way that seems coincidental but eventually forms a pattern, near events of misfortune. They tend to be skilled at appearing to help while being the cause of what they're helping with. This last trait is the most difficult to detect and the most consistent across accounts. Think about what that looks like from the inside of a community. The person who always seems to know when something bad has happened. The person who arrives quickly with assistance after a misfortune, who is kind and generous in those moments, and whose presence near suffering you slowly begin to notice is not coincidental. The person who benefits subtly from the difficulties of others. The person whose kindness you have been accepting for years before the pattern becomes visible. Identifying a Skinwalker is not a dramatic revelation. It is a slow and terrible accumulation of moments that, viewed individually, mean nothing, but viewed as a sequence, mean something you cannot unknow. The second category is physical. In human form, the Skinwalker's eyes are wrong in a specific way. Not dramatically wrong, subtly wrong. The reflective quality that belongs in an animal's eyes, appearing in a human face, visible most clearly in low light or firelight. People who have recognised a Skinwalker in human form often describe the moment as one of retroactive understanding. The eyes were always slightly wrong. It just took a specific lighting condition to see it clearly. This is, if you think about it, one of the more psychologically cruel design features of the whole arrangement. The tell is there the entire time. Every interaction you ever had with this person, it was present. You just didn't have the right angle. So when you finally do see it, sitting across a fire from someone you thought you knew, watching the light catch their eyes in a way that it should not, the horror is not just what you're seeing now. It is the recalibration of every conversation you thought you understood, every favour that seemed kind, every moment of apparent concern. Your brain goes back through all of it at once, reclassifying. That process is rapid, and it is not pleasant. The third category is situational. If you hear the voice of someone you trust coming from an unexpected direction at night, calling you outside, the traditional guidance is not to investigate. The voice mimicry is precise enough to pass under ordinary conditions. It fails primarily when you apply deliberate scrutiny to it, when you stop and ask it something only the real person would know, when you notice that it is repeating your name with slightly too much insistence, slightly too much urgency, in a way that the real person would not. The real person who loves you doesn't sound quite that desperate to get you to open the door. The traditional advice is to call back through the door, ask a question, make it specific enough that only the real person would know the answer. The voice outside, if it is what you suspect it is, will either answer incorrectly or stop responding entirely and wait in silence, hoping you'll open the door anyway. At which point your next move should be, do not open the door. This seems obvious stated plainly. It is considerably less obvious at 2 a.m, when the voice sounds exactly like your mother and it is telling you she is hurt. The Skinwalker is not guessing at which emotional lever to pull. It has been watching you long enough to know exactly which one you cannot ignore. The traditional methods for dealing with a Skinwalker once identified are limited and specific. Shooting with a bullet dipped in white ash, aimed at the neck or the hand. a powerful medicine person performing ceremonies to turn the Skinwalker's own power back on itself. And the most unusual method, saying the Skinwalker's full name aloud, publicly, in a setting where others can hear. According to Navajo tradition, this strips the Skinwalker of its power. The named one then sickens and dies within 3 days, consumed by the evil that could no longer hide behind anonymity. The naming method is interesting for what it implies. The Skinwalker's power depends in part on concealment, on operating in a community that suspects but cannot confirm, on the gap between what people sense and what they can say. The act of naming closes that gap publicly and irrevocably, and the tradition holds that this is enough. The thing that relies on not being spoken cannot survive being spoken. There is something almost elegant about that, considered from a distance. The Skinwalker spent years accumulating power through secrecy, through the careful management of what other people knew and didn't know, through operating in the space between suspicion and proof. And the thing that undoes all of it is someone saying their name out loud in front of witnesses. No weapons required, no elaborate counter-ceremony, just that person, that name, said clearly, in public. The Skinwalker built an entire architecture of darkness around avoiding exactly that moment. One sentence and the architecture comes down. That is either poetic justice or the most expensive lesson in information management ever recorded, depending on your perspective. There is a symmetry in that, given what we know about why the Navajo guard this knowledge so carefully. The Skinwalker cannot survive being named. The knowledge of the Skinwalker cannot survive being shared carelessly. In both cases, the act of speaking carries consequences that silence does not. What the community learned across generations of managing this presence in their lives was that the relationship between speech and harm is not metaphorical. Saying certain things at certain times to certain people causes specific outcomes that unsaying them cannot reverse. This is a framework for understanding language that most of the outside world does not share, which is part of why the Navajo approach to this legend has been so consistently misread as superstition. It is not superstition. It is a very old and very specific understanding of how information moves through communities and what it does when it gets there. And that brings us to the question that the title of tonight's story has been building towards since the beginning. Not just why the Navajo won't talk about it, but why the silence itself is the most honest answer they have ever given. So why won't the Navajo talk about skinwalkers? You have most of the pieces now. The origin, the powers, the history of what happens to communities that carry this belief across generations. The Witch Purge of 1878, the Long Walk and what it did to a people whose spiritual foundation was inseparable from their land. The way the internet absorbed the name and built a content ecosystem around it, while the living tradition continued existing quietly in the communities it actually belongs to. But the silence itself still needs explaining, because it is not a simple silence. It is not one thing. There are several layers to it, and they operate at different levels of the belief system. Collapsing them into a single explanation is exactly the kind of thing that produces those confident 30-second summaries that get 10,000 shares and miss the point entirely. The first layer is the most practical. Speaking the name of the Skinwalker, particularly at night, is believed to attract its attention. Not metaphorically, functionally. The Skinwalker hears its name and moves toward the sound. This is consistent across accounts spanning more than a century of documentation. It is also the reason that the standard advice from Navajo elders on the subject has always been the same and has never changed to accommodate people who find it inconvenient. Do not say the name at night. Do not say it in places you do not know. Do not say it in front of people you have not earned the right to trust. If you must discuss it at all, do it in daylight, in a known space. with people whose discretion you would stake something on. The people who ignored this advice and nothing happened to them are the people who assume the advice is decorative. The people who did not ignore it are the people with the longer institutional memory. The second layer is communal protection. A skinwalker that is actively operating in a community depends on a specific kind of information environment. It depends on people not being certain, not being able to name what they suspect, not being willing to say aloud to others what they have begun to understand about the person they see every day, the one who is always around when something goes wrong and always seems to leave before it gets worse. The silence the community maintains is, in part, the silence of people who have learned that discretion is a form of self-defense. You do not announce what you know until you are certain enough to say the full name, publicly, in a setting where it counts. Anything short of that is just handing information to something that already knows your house. The third layer is the one that Adrian Keene and other Indigenous scholars have written about most directly. This is the cultural survival layer. When sacred knowledge is shared with outsiders who have no framework for it, no context for the weight it carries, no understanding of the specific social structure it is embedded in, the knowledge does not survive the transfer intact. It arrives somewhere else as entertainment, as aesthetic, as content to be engaged with and discarded by lunchtime, and then the people it belongs to start receiving questions they are not supposed to answer, based on a version of their tradition that they did not authorize and would not recognize. The Navajo do not discuss the skinwalker with outsiders because the discussion itself cost them something that cannot be recovered. Not because they are being precious, because they have watched for several decades now exactly what happens when they are not careful, and the watching has confirmed the original position. The knowledge that survives in a community is the knowledge the community protects. This is true of agricultural techniques and navigation methods and medical practices and spiritual traditions. What gets extracted and circulated loses the context that made it functional, and what remains in the community diminishes proportionally. The skinwalker tradition has survived because the Navajo maintained it carefully, passing it through trusted channels to people who understood what it was for. Every time a piece of it gets pulled into the public domain, the public gets an inert fragment and the community loses a live one. The math on this is not complicated. It just requires caring about the community's side of the equation, which the outside world historically has not found particularly urgent. J.K. Rowling discovered this in 2016 when she incorporated the skinwalker into her fiction, publishing a piece on Pottermore that placed the naaldlooshii inside the Potterverse as a native North American magical being. The Navajo response was unambiguous. The specific objection was not about creative rights in the legal sense. Nobody was filing a trademark claim on their spiritual tradition, though the situation raises questions about what such a claim might even look like. The objection was about what it meant for a living sacred tradition to appear, stripped of context and reshaped for a fantasy franchise, in front of the Harry Potter readership, which is one of the largest audiences any piece of fiction has ever commanded. Those millions of readers now carried a version of the naaldlooshii in their heads. That version had been handled by someone who encountered it for the purposes of world building and felt qualified to incorporate it. The Navajo had not published their beliefs for public use. They had maintained them carefully within their communities. Rowling's piece did not ask, and the Navajo were left explaining, to an audience that already thought it knew the answer, what had actually been lost in the adaptation. The explanation, of course, circulated far less widely than the original piece. As cultural extraction events go, it was not unusual in any of its components. What made it visible was the scale. The follow-up piece Rowling published after the Navajo pushback acknowledged the criticism and pledged to do better research going forward. This is the standard life cycle. The extraction happens, the community objects, the creator expresses good intentions. The original piece remains in circulation, read by the same audience it always had, carrying the same misrepresentation it always carried. The good intentions are documented, the damage is not undone. This particular loop has run so many times, in so many directions, that it would be efficient at this point to just print it on a card and hand it out in advance. Now let's talk about what modern encounters actually look like, because the Skinwalker did not stop operating when the internet started writing about it. The accounts continue. They come from people who live near the Navajo Nation, from Navajo community members speaking carefully about things they have experienced, and occasionally from people who ended up somewhere they did not expect to be at night in the Southwest, and came away with something they could not file under any category they already owned. The most consistent category of modern encounter is the vehicle account. Someone driving alone on a reservation road at night, isolated stretch, no other traffic, the kind of road where your headlights are the only light source in any direction, and you become aware of how small that circle actually is. An animal appears alongside the car, keeping pace. The animal keeps pace at 40 miles an hour, then 60, then 70. The animal keeps pace. At some point the driver either accelerates beyond what the animal can maintain, or makes the decision to pull over and look at it directly, which is where the accounts diverge sharply. The ones who pulled over have more specific things to say about what they saw. Most of them wished, and this is consistent enough to be worth noting, that they had not been so curious about it. Curiosity is a reasonable default response to unexplained phenomena everywhere else. On a reservation road in Arizona at 2 a.m, it may need revision. Every account that begins with "so I pulled over to get a better look" ends in one of two ways. Either nothing happened and the person telling the story sounds reasonable, or something happened and the person telling the story has trouble finishing the sentence. The ratio of those two outcomes is not 50-50, and the people who live in that part of the world tend to drive through without stopping, in a way that suggests they already know which direction it skews. The specific detail that repeats across these accounts, from sources who never met each other and reported decades apart, is the eyes, in the headlights. Wrong. Not the eyes of a wolf or a coyote. The eyes of something that has eyes on the inside and an animal arrangement on the outside, and in the specific light conditions of a car's high beams, the inside shows through. This is the same tell described in the daytime identification framework, visible in firelight. It turns out it is also visible in headlights. This is not information that makes driving through reservation land at night more comfortable, but it is at least consistent. The second category is the sound account. Voices heard from outside a home or vehicle at night. Not frightening voices. That is the specific detail that makes them frightening. The voice of your mother, your child, your partner, coming from a direction they should not be approaching from, saying something that produces exactly the response they need you to have. Your name first, then something that implies they need help, then repetition, with slight variations, the way a person would repeat themselves if they were not being heard, if they were worried, if they were standing outside in the cold and waiting for you to open the door. The accounts in which people did not respond and stayed where they were tend to resolve without incident. The voice eventually stops. The night goes back to being just the night. The accounts in which people responded are shorter, which is itself a form of data. There is a specific pattern to how the voice accounts develop. The voice does not begin with something terrifying. It begins with something ordinary, your name. A question about whether you are awake. A statement that implies a small and manageable problem just outside the door. The escalation is gradual, calibrated to the specific threshold of the person inside. The point at which the concern generated by staying put begins to outweigh the instinct not to open the door. The Skinwalker is not guessing at that threshold. It has had time to study the person it is targeting. It knows approximately where the threshold sits, and it is walking toward it from the safe side. Patient enough to take 20 minutes, patient enough to take longer, if longer is what the situation requires. The discipline required to not respond to a voice that sounds exactly like someone you love is not nothing. The Navajo tradition, which has been refining its understanding of exactly this situation for several thousand years, offers the following guidance. Call back through a barrier. Ask something specific. Wait for the answer. The real person, if it is the real person, will answer correctly and the situation resolves. The thing outside, if it is the thing outside, will either answer incorrectly or go quiet in a way that has a different quality than silence. A silence that is waiting rather than absent. You will know the difference if you're paying attention, and at that point you have all the information you need without having opened the door to get it. The third category is the suspicion account, and this one requires more careful handling because it comes from within communities and involves living people. Someone whose behaviour has been observed over a period of time, livestock dying around them at a rate that does not match their neighbours, illness moving through families they're close to in ways that cluster rather than spread, wealth accumulating without clear source, presence near misfortune that becomes, over years, too patterned to explain as coincidence. These accounts are not shared publicly. They circulate in trusted circles carefully, with awareness of what a false accusation costs in a community with a long memory. The person telling the story almost never names the person they are describing. The person listening almost always understands who is meant. This is the pattern that Clucone was working around in 1944 when his documentation started producing gaps. Not because his sources did not know, because they were doing exactly this, sharing within trusted circles what could not be said broadly, and a researcher with a notebook is, by definition, a member of a different circle. The naming method, as a resolution to confirm suspicion, has not disappeared from Navajo practice. It has become more selective, which is what happens to tools when the cost of misusing them becomes fully understood. You do not name someone without certainty. Certainty requires time and observation, and a specific kind of courage, because the moment you name a skinwalker publicly, everything the skinwalker was protecting becomes your problem. The person who names them is now known to the thing they named. If the thing does not die within 3 days, the namer has a different kind of problem that requires immediate and specific attention. The naming is not a safe action. It is a calculated one, made by someone who has decided that the cost of not naming is higher than the cost of naming incorrectly, and who is prepared to manage the consequences either way. This calculus is one of the things that makes the Skinwalker belief system harder to dismiss than it is often treated. It is not a system that produces mass panics or convenient scapegoating. It produces sustained, careful, community-level observation with a built-in accountability mechanism. If you name someone and you are wrong, you are the person who made a destructive false accusation in a community that will remember it. If you name someone and you are right, you are the person who took on personal risk to protect everyone else. The incentive structure pushes against carelessness in both directions simultaneously, which is a considerably more sophisticated design than most outside commentators are expecting when they come to this subject. Compare this to the Salem witch trials, which ran on the opposite principle entirely. In Salem, the accusation was free. You could accuse someone of being a witch with no personal risk based on a dream, and the accused had to disprove a negative in front of a court that had already decided what it believed. The Navajo framework costs the accuser something whether they are right or wrong. Getting it right means you survive what comes next. Getting it wrong means you live the rest of your life in a community that has a long and specific memory for the people who destroyed an innocent person standing in it. Salem produced 20 executions in 3 months. The Navajo tradition, in several thousand years of operation, produced a single organized purge that the community itself recognized, in retrospect, as the result of an extreme external crisis. The outside world looked at both of these and decided only one of them was superstitious. The Skinwalker, in the Navajo tradition, lives on its victims' unexpired lives. This is the part that does not make it into most summaries. It is not a poetic metaphor. It is a functional claim about the mechanics of how the power sustains itself. The initiation purchased entry into the Witchery Way. But the ongoing harm is the payment schedule. Stop causing harm, lose the power. The Skinwalker is therefore structurally prevented from stopping, not by external force, by the internal logic of what it chose. It must keep producing damage in order to maintain what the damage bought. A community that contains an active Skinwalker is not dealing with a threat that will exhaust itself or move on, or decide the effort is not worth it. It is dealing with something that cannot afford to stop by its own terms, and that will therefore continue until it is stopped from outside. The specific word in Navajo for what the Skinwalker becomes through this process, over decades of operating in this mode, losing the last recognizable traces of the person it was before the initiation, is not something that gets shared outside the tradition. What does get shared is the direction of travel. The person who chose this path gave up something that cannot be recovered and received something that cannot be returned. There is no reversal ceremony. There is no path back to Hoju for someone who has walked the Witchery Way far enough. The tradition does not offer redemption to the Skinwalker, not because it is without compassion, but because the Skinwalker has operated for long enough in a mode that makes the concept inapplicable. Some choices do not leave a door open behind them. The medicine person who became a Skinwalker began with years of training in how to heal. They spent that time learning the chants, the ceremonies, the sand paintings, the specific knowledge of what breaks harmony and how to restore it. That knowledge did not disappear when they crossed the line. They retained all of it. They simply reoriented the entire application. The healer who becomes a predator is not less skilled than the healer who did not. They are the same skill set, pointed in the opposite direction, with the additional capability that the Witchery Way provides. This is, among other things, the reason why a medicine person accused of being a Skinwalker cannot simply demonstrate their healing abilities to clear their name. The healing abilities are not evidence of innocence. They were always present in both versions. Which brings us finally to what the title of tonight's story has been holding. Why won't the Navajo talk about Skinwalkers? And why, given everything you now know, should you think carefully about how freely you've been speaking about them tonight? The full answer has 3 parts. The first, speaking the name draws attention. This is the position of people with the deepest possible investment in being right about it. They are not protecting a fairy tale. They are protecting a practical framework developed across thousands of years of living inside a specific reality that the outside world does not share but also does not own. You may not accept that framework, but you are on their conceptual land tonight, going through their knowledge for your own purposes, and the asymmetry of that is worth sitting with for a moment. The second, the Skinwalker's operational power depends on the space between suspicion and certainty. The casual circulation of Skinwalker content online, the Reddit threads, and the TikTok videos, and yes, the sleep channel you're currently listening to, adds to an environment where the name is said constantly and carelessly, by people who do not mean it in the way it matters, in conditions that make it harder for the communities that do mean it to use the signals they rely on. The outside world's noise around this subject is not neutral. It changes the information environment in which real Navajo communities manage a real concern. If the name means nothing in the mouth of a stranger, it becomes harder to know when the name means something in the mouth of someone who knows. The Navajo were managing a specific functional warning system. The outside world, entirely unaware of the system's purpose, started flooding the same channel with noise. The internet did not do this maliciously. The internet does not do most things maliciously. It does them enthusiastically, and at volume, and then moves on before the people downstream can calculate what was lost. The third, what you heard tonight, is a fraction. The complete tradition, the full working knowledge of what the Skinwalker is and how it operates and how a community actually survives its presence, is held by people who will not share it, and the reason they will not share it is the most important thing this story has been trying to say. They have watched what happens when they do. They have watched their knowledge become entertainment, their warnings become aesthetics, their hard-won understanding of something genuinely dangerous become the backdrop for a television program and a merchandise line and a $300 weekend visit to a ranch in Utah that bears their tradition's borrowed name. The silence is not superstition. It is not cultural shyness. It is the considered position of people who learned, through direct and painful experience, that some things survive only because they are not said to everyone, and that the cost of talking is paid not by the people doing the talking, but by the communities the talking was taken from. You came here tonight to learn about a creature. You're leaving with something slightly harder to put down. The story of the Skinwalker is a story about what happens when sacred knowledge meets a world that treats all knowledge as available, about the specific damage that carelessness causes to things that require care, about the difference between knowing the name of something and understanding what it means to say it out loud, in the dark, to no one in particular. The Navajo kept their silence for reasons they understood better than anyone who would ask them to break it. Tonight at least you understand why. Now rest. Let the high desert go quiet. Let the red rock country settle back into dark, the way it has been settling for longer than anyone currently alive has been keeping track. Whatever is out there at the edge of the light, keeping pace with something you cannot see, has been there since before the word for it existed in any language you speak. It was never waiting for you to say its name. It was waiting to find out if you would.